Before we get started, I want to remind everybody to check out our website at www.whenthelightsgoutpodcast.com. Check out our Instagram at whenthelightsgoutpod and our Twitter at lightsgoutpod. Also, if you're listening on Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a 5-star review.
Of all the topics that I've researched for this podcast, the one that we're talking about today has been both my favorite and least favorite topic to look into. It truly is interesting to see all of the preconceptions that I had about this situation that were completely false and unsubstantiated. However, on the flip side of this, there is a reason that I and many more have countless misconceptions when it comes to the U.S. women's national soccer team's fight for equal pay. The entire situation is a complete mess. There is so much lying and drivel surrounding this topic from players, fans, U.S. Soccer Federation, and media coverage of it that it is amazingly difficult to figure out what the true story is here. In fact, even after reviewing nearly 20 articles on the issue, I still don't know everything there is to know about the situation. With other national soccer federations like the Brazilian Soccer Federation making the decision to guarantee equal pay for their women's teams, why hasn't the USSF done the same? I'm Monty.
I'm Emma.
I'm Moof.
And on today's edition of the When the Lights Go Out podcast, we are going to be talking about the situation surrounding the fair wages for the U.S. women's national soccer team. First of all, thank you so much, Emma, for coming onto the podcast today. This is now your second podcast with us, and I'm glad we didn't completely scare you off for good after your talk about the state of women in men's sports, which the listeners should definitely check out if they haven't gotten to so far. With that being said, let's get into this. To give a quick background, the lawsuits have been piling up from the U.S. women's national team against the USSF since 2016, with the most recent case being brought up in 2019 and decided just a few months ago. In these lawsuits, the women's national team has consistently made the argument that they are not being compensated fairly from a proportional standpoint or from a results standpoint, while Carlos Cordeiro, the president of the U.S. Soccer Federation, makes the claims that women were actually paid more in recent years than the men have been. In response to this, the women and the women's national soccer team as a whole have made the claims that while they were being paid more than the U.S. men's soccer team, Cordeiro was including the NWSL salaries, but not the MLS salaries when making this comparison. And they also didn't include World Cup prizes, which would collectively bring the men's salary to be higher than the women's during these years. So I guess what I thought was kind of interesting about this was that when making these arguments, Cordeiro tends to inflate the amount the women's are making and deflate the men's are making. So I was kind of wondering what you guys thought about that.
I mean, that's just an admission of guilt right there, I guess, right? Because you're picking and choosing what data you want, but it's not like similar data sets. You're picking what you want from one side and then not choosing what you want to include from the other side. It's just not equivalent. It's not a good comparison.
I would definitely agree with what you're saying. And I feel like since the structures of it are different, I mean, why not just say they're set up differently and own it rather than trying to, kind of use it as a cop-out.
Yeah, and to kind of talk about the structural differences, the women's team is really focused on getting the guaranteed contracts versus the men's who are really focused on getting the incentives to get more money in the long term, or at least for the players who play a lot. A big reason for that is kind of based on the different salaries that they get from their club teams. So when looking at the women's teams, they make a significantly less amount of money from their club teams versus the men's teams. At the top level, women's players make about £10,000 a month on average with clubs like Wolfsburg in Europe, whereas men make well over that with the top clubs in their sport. And when just looking at the U.S. side of things, the women make as little as $16,000 a year with the NWSL, which is only barely above the poverty line in the U.S., while the men's make significantly more than this. So I was kind of wondering what you guys thought, how this kind of impacts the way that they could even approach the CBA negotiations in the future.
It's interesting because in most men's professional sports, they don't have to go out to a different league in their off season and make more money. Whereas in women's sports, this is unfortunately kind of a regular thing. In women's soccer, as we're talking about, the NWSL pays significantly less. So women look to go to international clubs where they're paid a lot more. And then in women's basketball, you're getting paid a little bit in the WNBA, but it's significantly more in the off season when you can go to Europe and play. I think the poverty line argument is like a very, very good one, because you look at what men's sports and nobody even comes close to that. Whereas in women's sports, it's like, unfortunately, not that surprising to hear that that's the case.
Right. And going off of that, you think in men's sports, there's the whole debate all the time of, are they overpaid? Do they deserve their pay? But you never see that in women's sports. You know, you look at women's sports and you're like, why aren't they paid?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of leads to a bunch of discussions like we're having here, just talking about, you really have to look into all the different aspects of it and try to figure it out with women's teams, where with men's, it's just kind of assumed that they're going to get the money because you just assume that they make more money for the TVs without even really looking into a lot of the information. So another aspect of having different CBAs is it kind of makes it more difficult to compare the different salaries of the men's and women's teams. So what I kind of found from this is that it really makes it hard to make the argument that the women's teams aren't getting paid fairly if they don't have the same structure, because you don't have a one-to-one comparison. So I was wondering kind of what you guys thought about that.
I mean, like, it's kind of the same thing with what you're saying with the argument that the USSF president was making. It's not a, like you said, one-to-one comparison. With his arguments, he's leaving out pieces of information on both sides. And here it's like they're two completely different systems. It's like pulling from the podcast we did earlier. It's like we're comparing women's lacrosse to men's lacrosse. They shouldn't be compared because there's very significant differences in each.
Going off that kind of one-to-one comparison type of thing, a lot of the claims that the women's national team has made is that if they were going to be doing one-to-one comparisons for the salary for women's players versus men's players, even when you take into account the amount that the two teams make, they should still be getting paid more. Which the USSF obviously is trying to make the argument against, saying that the men bring in a lot more money. But what I thought that was really interesting when doing this research is that the women's team's not asking for the exact same amount the men are. They're literally just asking for a proportionate amount based on the amount they're bringing in through TV contracts and attendance and figures like those.
Honestly, this is the part that, like, I've majored and, like, I want to go into sports business, but this is the part that, like, really pisses me off, because sports is always advertised as the only true meritocracy. And then this is one of those things where it's like, it's absolutely not. But the women have been so much more successful than the men have in like the last 10 years, but they're just not getting their due.
And like kind of in response to that, I would think that Carlos Cordillera and the USSF would make the argument that the men's team make more money. But the problem with this argument is there's no way to, in a lot of the aspects, it's hard to really tell who's actually making more money, especially when it comes to TV rights. So going back to the CBAs, when they negotiate for TV rights with the different TV networks and stuff, all of U.S. soccer is actually collectively put into one bundle together. So they do the contracts for MLS, US, or NWSL, the men's soccer team, and women's soccer teams at the same time. So while there are some figures that people usually point to saying that the men's bring in more viewership, there's no concrete way to really prove that.
That's like, they just have to do a better job, I guess. Like, I feel like that's an oversight thing.
Right. Mm-hmm. There's definitely disparities that you would see as you're figuring those numbers out, but they're just overlooked. But also one thing I'd note about the U.S. women's national team is just their visibility. Like, you think in this time we're in right now, where social justice is such a big factor, you hear the women's national team advocating for it all the time. Like, I don't hear anything about the men's doing it. And I think despite these battles that the U.S. women's national team is a part of right now, like, they're able to separate that from really being a positive force in the community. And, you know, maybe that's one of their other objectives as a team. And I think it's good that they're still tackling that. They're not letting this sort of adversity deter them.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how much they're still involved with all these issues. Whereas the men's team, as far as I know, beyond their fight against racism in Europe, because there's a lot of problems with European soccer teams, especially in Italy, having racist chants from the fans towards the players. But beyond that, I haven't heard the men's soccer team really not being like as upfront as the women's team has been.
Right.
And one thing that's really kind of interesting is there are even some players, the men's soccer team, that have come out almost like frustrated with the women's team asking for money, which has always kind of confused me because the U.S. Soccer Federation makes like an extra $16 million a year in pure profits. So I don't see why they think the women's soccer team getting paid more would have any impact on them.
It's just, yeah, that's just kind of like a funny, also dumb thing. Like the money that they're gonna get shouldn't, if everything's done right, shouldn't affect the amount of money that you're getting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that profit figure that I brought up before is kind of brings up like another side point as far as like how this is covered, because I found two different conflicting sources saying the U.S. Soccer Federation makes a lot of extra money, but I also found another source saying that they're barely making enough, so the woman getting paid more would directly take from the amount they can pay the men. So it's kind of interesting. There are claims that like the U.S. has lost $28 million of the women from 2009 and 2019, and also lost an extra $3 million from the men over the same time period. But there are other reports reporting that they're making over $150 million in surplus every single year. So it's just kind of a frustrating aspect of looking into these different things because no one's really upfront with the figures and how much they're making and how much they're not.
Yeah, and I would also say like another aspect of this is like there's nowhere else these women athletes or women soccer players can go other than international, right? There's no competition in the US, so what are they supposed to do? Like, and especially if we're talking about the US national team, like they're US nationals. There's literally no other competition. So unless you go out to a different country, live there, become a citizen, which is a lot of work, takes a lot of time, what are you supposed to do? There's no other organization to be like competitive off of, like you can't just threaten to be like, oh I'm gonna go here because they're offering me more money.
Yeah, kind of like throw it back to the Teams Moving Cities podcast where there's no other professional sports league in the US.
They're already in a lower status position from a negotiating standpoint. So like there's not they don't have any, I guess, power other than the fact that they have done better than the men. They have no monetary like power over the USSF.
Mm. Yeah, they can't really threaten to hold out to get better contracts because a lot of the players on the team just wouldn't be able to financially support themselves during that time. So now that we're kind of talking a little bit more on a international scale, it might be a good time to talk about the disparities that come from the World Cup. So another important aspect to this fight for equal pay comes in the form of the U.S. women's national soccer team's fight to get equal winnings from the World Cup. While this fight is arguably more with FIFA, the World Cup earnings don't actually go straight to the players. So you can actually make the argument that the U.S. Soccer Federation could maybe look at the direct viewership of the men's World Cup and the women's World Cup and kind of divvy up these winnings based on that. So I guess to kind of support why I would make that suggestion is that while most other countries have much higher viewership for the men's World Cup, the U.S. is actually unique in the world where there's a huge disparity between the men's and women's World Cup and not in favor of the men's. In the United States, more people really watch the women's World Cup than they do the men's World Cup. So I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts about the way that the U.S. Soccer Federation like kind of deals out the rewards from the World Cup based on that.
I do think it is a tough position to be in because, like you mentioned, soccer in the U.S. isn't like an end-all be-all, but you go to Europe, you go to a lot of different places in South America, really anywhere else in the world, and soccer is the sport. Like, that's what the men want to play. That's what the women, I mean, not as much, not to the same degree, but, soccer is just a bigger deal. And then you come to the U.S. and it's hard to be like, the women aren't getting the same viewership. And yeah, in the U.S., we're watching the U.S. women's national team because they're actually competing in the championships. But it's just like across the world, the viewership's not the same.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the viewership being different in different countries does really complicate the issue of, especially for FIFA, in deciding how much the prizes should be for the different World Cups. To give some context to this, in the most recent World Cups, the FIFA gave a $30 million prize to the women and a $400 million in total prizes for the Men's World Cup, which FIFA claims comes from the $6.1 billion in men's revenue and $131 million in revenue for the Women's World Cup. So I saw Mufidal kind of shaking his head a little bit there. Do you want to kind of talk about it a bit?
That disparity is so low. And like, it's hard for me to believe that it is that large, because like, I don't have any metrics to support myself when I'm saying this, but like, I don't think that. So the way you get TV revenue is through selling packages to TV networks, who then sell ads because they think they're going to make up that contract price from the ad revenue they get. I don't think that many more people watch the men's FIFA tournament than the women's, especially if you're saying more people in the US watch the women's than the men's. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting comparing it. I mean, it is in the US, it's a much bigger draw for the Women's World Cup, but to kind of provide maybe a slight counterpoint to that, the Men's World Cup does bring in 4 times the amount of viewers, according to one source I could find. But even then, it doesn't really account for the full 13 times larger prize pool there is for the Women's World Cup than there is for the men's. Or the other way around. Sorry about that.
It really just shows the reality of women's sport, though. I mean, around the whole world, it's not as big of a deal as men's sport.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, we look at this in the United States as a big deal, but are other countries looking like, oh, the Women's World Cup, like, the prize is, what did you say, 6.1 versus 131 million? Like, do other countries really look at that number and see a problem?
Yeah, as far as I could tell, there's not really a ton of countries that are having the same discussion. Fortunately, recently, the Brazilian Soccer Federation just guaranteed completely equal pay, like not even in proportion, but 1-to-1 salaries for the men's and women's teams. But that's really the only other case I've heard about this from like a global perspective.
Yes, there's the whole aspect of how are you going to pay the players if you're not making enough, I guess, for like both sides. So then you want to pay who's bringing in the most money more, obviously. But like, this is a naive perspective for me, I know it is, but like, just from a sports basic level, you're putting in the same amount of work, and in the case of the US national teams, you're being so much more successful than your male counterparts. It's just a sad reality, I guess. Like, I have no words.
Yeah, and I think you can actually make the argument that the massive amount of success the women's team is having almost hurts them in some ways. So like, taking a look at the 2015 World Cup, the first game the U.S. women's soccer team played was against Thailand, where they won 13-0. This 13-0 result really emphasizes like the competitive disadvantage we're having between different countries around the world, which really hurts the women's game in general. Like, as much as the U.S. puts a lot of time into developing the U.S. women's soccer team, it's just not the case in a lot of other countries. So it just doesn't seem like a lot of these other national teams are really ready to be competing against teams like the U.S., which not only hurts viewership, but it hurts the sport in general, and that the games just aren't fair.
And to that point, there were a lot of people after that 13-0 win that were saying like, oh, why would they beat them like that? Like, this is just a developing sport. But then I feel like I remember players on the Thailand team saying like, no, we wouldn't want them to take it easy on us. Like, this is the reality of sport. And if they win 13-0, they win 13-0.
Also, like, soccer is a sport where like the amount of goals you score matters. Like, if another team in the group went 4-0, the goal difference matters. So if they went 13-0 upon them, like, that's just competitive advantage. Like, that's just, honestly, I would say that's just good soccer.
Yeah, I always thought the argument for like taking it easy was just kind of stupid in all sports, because at this level that they're playing, you're all professionals. There's no reason you should be holding back against fully grown adults who can deal with getting crushed. If you get crushed, you can kind of just take the mindset of, yes, I need to get better. There's no real, and like, I can understand with little kids not wanting to do it, but at this age, they should be able to deal with that.
If you get rocked to 13-0, like, that's just a kick in the butt that you need to get better.
Right. And like both teams are obviously out there playing to win at this level.
On a side note, I kind of want to take a few minutes to kind of talk about the ways that these sports are being covered and why it really frustrates me. So when I was doing a lot of research for this podcast, a lot of the articles I was reading were very highly skewed in one direction or the other. And this kind of comes with how politicized this topic has surprisingly become when it's really not something that I would think has to be political. So while this does happen on both sides, the example I'm giving right now is kind of one that's in support of the USSF, but I don't want to imply that that's the only way this really comes from. So specifically, one writer made the claim that anyone that makes the argument that the Women's World Cup is making less is lying. While it may be true that there's no concrete evidence to support this based on the fact that their TV deals are negotiated in the same way that they are for the U.S. Soccer Federation for the World Cup, where they're all lumped together with the Men's World Cup and Women's World Cup, to act like there's not somewhat of a difference in the profits that the men's were making versus what the women's were making really came across as a disingenuous argument to me. To kind of support this, beyond the 4 times viewership that the Men's World Cup gets internationally compared to the Women's World Cup, they also make significantly more money from the tickets that they sell. So to elaborate this, while I couldn't find an official stat of this online, based on the ticket packages for the World Cup, the Men's World Cup likely made more than $305 million, while the Women's World Cup probably made somewhere above $13.25 million from the ticket sales. So I was kind of wondering how you guys think that making a disingenuous argument such as the one that the writer that I'm talking about right now kind of hurts the case for teams like the U.S. women's soccer team.
I would say that the tough pill to swallow around this one is just the amount of misinformation and how unclear the statistics really are. I mean, come to a clear conclusion on the reality of the situation. There's no straightforward, I guess, information that makes it easy to decipher.
I feel like when you have a bunch of lies like that out there, it kind of can hurt the argument in future negotiations. People are just going to assume whatever the U.S. women's soccer team says is going to be a lie because people are lying and stuff like that. And I think you can kind of compare it to the way that almost all news is talked about these days, where it's kind of like an intentional spread of misinformation or sometimes unintentional spread that can really hurt the arguments from one side or the other, where people just, it's almost like making constant straw mans for different arguments where people will put out different pieces of information that are obviously not true and try to pretend that one side is believing that when it's not really the full case. So moving on, let's take a quick look at some of the non-monetary disadvantages that the U.S. women's soccer team goes through. So the U.S. women's soccer team claims they're treated in lesser ways in many other ways as well, from insufficient development to travel accommodations, in addition to just the unfair pay. To kind of give some context behind this, I guess we start talking about the different ways they help develop the sport for U.S. women's soccer. So one of the biggest individual events I could find that really annoyed me with the way they treat U.S. women's soccer development was how they scheduled, or when they scheduled the different dates for different tournament finals. So in 2019, the Women's World Cup, which should be a big deal and kind of built up as like the big event for the year for the women's soccer, got scheduled for the same day that the South American Copa America men's final and the North American CONCACAF Gold Cup final were for the men's teams, which is really weird because these tournaments don't really mean anything. So what do you guys think about this way that they scheduled these finals for the different tournaments?
I mean, I guess it's just like the ultimate reflection of what they think about women's soccer.
Right. It's just an afterthought type of thing. Like, we can schedule these other events that are men's and they'll kind of overshadow. Is that the word?
Hey, is there anything important on this date?
Yeah,
no?
It's
okay.
Like they did
right. Like,
we'll just schedule this other final for this.
This seems like a good weekend.
Yeah.
Or
it's kind of ridiculous. They couldn't even like push them back one day.
Right.
This is the biggest game in the women's sport, and they're just going to put 2 other non-important finals on the same day. It would kind of draw away viewership.
So, I mean, like, a good comparison to this is like with March Madness. They schedule the women's games and men's games on offsetting days specifically so they don't interfere with each other. And, I mean, I guess you could say what you want about the NCAA, but at least they believe in equality.
Yeah, at least somewhat. Like,
yeah.
At least they're not as obvious as FIFA and the U.S. Soccer Federation. They just don't care.
The NCAA is trash.
And beyond just like the way they treat them as far as publicity, they don't even treat them the same as far as other factors like the fields they're playing on or travel accommodations. So to kind of give a stat for this, in 2017, the U.S. women's soccer team had 0 chartered flights when the men had 17 in that same year. And to kind of talk about the different fields they're playing on, the U.S. Soccer Federation or women's soccer team complains frequently about the amount of times they have to play on turf versus playing on real grass because of the safety implications of playing those types of fields. So in 2014, the women played 21% of their games on turf when the men played only 2%. And from 2014 to 2017, the men's only played 1 game in that entire 3-year period on turf, when the women played 4 out of their last 9 alone in 2017 on turf. So I see that Emma's kind of shaking her head a bit on that. So I feel like you might have something to say.
I mean, it's not going to contribute much. I just think that's like crazy because you know how big the risk of like ACL injuries is in soccer, and the studies show that playing on turf just kind of increases that even more. So playing on those, artificial surfaces, it's like they're at this level and they can't even get a good field.
Mm-hmm. Like, they're not getting the pay they deserve, and then they're like, in some jobs you might get like paid a little bit less, but then sometimes the benefits are going to be much better than a job where you're getting paid more but the benefits are worse. But they're getting the short end of the stick on both ends. Like they're getting paid very little, and then they're not getting the benefits that they should be getting.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and then their lack of pay, like if they do sustain an injury on that surface, one, their career is probably, going to be done to begin with, and 2, are they even going to have the money from their job to?
Yeah. I mean, like in a regular job, you might not get the 401k match you want, and then here you're just going to get a torn ACL.
Right.
Yeah. And it's kind of crazy to me after looking at these stats that USSF still tries to make the claim that they offer the same accommodations to both teams when it's just clear from looking at the pure numbers that they're not.
We literally have the receipts.
At that point, you just need to own up to it and be like, hey, we don't care about the women's team here. Like,
before you guys take off, I quickly want to talk about the legal results for the women's court cases. As a whole, these rulings have actually been overwhelmingly in favor of the USSF over the women's soccer team. In the past half-decade, the ruling in California was that the discrimination under the Pay Act did not occur, and the federal courts ruled in favor of the USSF as well. These rulings were made mostly on the basis that in 2019, the women made more on a per-game basis, and that the differing setups between the CBAs kind of made it difficult to compare the structures, therefore not really giving them a strong enough case to rule completely in favor of the women. All is not lost for the U.S. women's national team, however, as they are still filing for the Title VII discrimination violations, which would probably be settled in court at some point in the near future.
I mean, considering the recent history of the court system of America, nothing's that surprising anymore. But
that kind of wraps up today's podcast. I guess what I really want to emphasize is how much the media can try and really throw you off on a lot of these numbers and things they throw out there without really supporting a lot of it. So whenever it comes to issues like this, please take the time to really research it and find some sources you can trust to give you a good idea of what's actually happening behind the scenes. I'm Monty.
I'm Moof.
And I'm Emma.
And this was When the Lights Go Out. I mean, whatever it takes,
Yeah,
get 'em to
exactly.
float.
Whatever floats your goat.
Yeah, if that's what it takes to get your goat to float, I say go for it.
Because boats already float. Boats already float.
A boat would be what to float.
Well, boats already float, though.
Yeah, boats already float.
You have to build a boat.
Yeah, but like, what if there's a hole in your boat that's gonna sink? Then you gotta float your boat. But goats, that wouldn't happen because you don't have to build a
You
boat.
just walk yourself
I don't think
You
you're
don't have to
making an
build a
argument.
goat, okay? You
I
gotta
feel like you're
float
making a
it.
different argument than
Boats
I
are
am here,
built in the
Moofidle.
same way boats are built, just by
No, there's
No.
biology involved with goats,
Yeah.
You
actually.
tell me
yeah, but biology. Monty, is biology not just?
Go ahead and say what you were gonna say, please. Isn't biology just like cellular carpentry? Like,
we're getting there. We're not there yet. But we're getting closer.